Good morning, everyone. So whether you're joining us in person or online, we'd like to welcome you to our keynote address for this year's Ethics Awareness Week. So as some of you know, our theme this year is AI and its human impact. And we've had a number of high quality panel discussions and lectures and workshops so far this week. And we have more to come both today and tomorrow. So if anyone is interested in joining any of those sessions, there are QR codes on the sides of the walls. You can just pull that up on your phone, and our full schedule is there. If you are here for a class and need credit, there are QR codes on the backs of chairs, which you'll need to log into and identify yourself. Another important thing for me to add is just how grateful I am for the work that goes into hosting Ethics Awareness Week. And I want to publicly thank everyone involved, the staff of the Center for the Study of Ethics, the Faculty Advisory Board, other colleagues across campus, and our guests who we brought to campus to talk about this very important subject. So we're very pleased this morning to have Dr. Nathan Walker with us. I'll give a brief introduction for Nate and then turn the time over to him so that he can spend as much time with you as possible for this session. So Dr. Nathan C. Walker is an award-winning First Amendment and human rights educator at Rutgers University, where he serves as a lecturer in the philosophy and religion and digital studies programs, and is a principal investigator for their AI ethics lab. His areas of expertise include First Amendment and human rights law, religion and education, and most notably for our purposes, AI ethics and law. He is the founding editor of AI and Human Rights Law, of the AI and Human Rights Index. He's a contributing researcher at the Institute of Ethics and AI at Technical University of Munich, and a visiting scholar at the Institute for the Ethics of AI at Oxford University. He earned his doctorate in First Amendment law from Columbia University, where he also received a master's degree in higher education administration. And finally, he received a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary and is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. I could go on at length about all of the awards and accomplishments and projects Nate has been involved in. I came to know him many years ago through our work on religion and education and some programs here in the state of Utah and across the country. He's truly a Renaissance man in the best sense of the term, and it's a delight and a treat to have him back at UVU. So his remarks this morning are entitled Moral Imagination from Smart to Wise AI. Please join me in welcoming Nathan Walker.
Thank you. Oh, I think you forgot to mention that I have 3 learning disabilities and an imposter syndrome. I'm really grateful to you, Brian. I'm very inspired by your leadership. I'm moved by your character and just how hospitable and generous you are. Thank you so much for your leadership. I also want to congratulate Evelyn Porter on the new role in directing the Applied AI Institute. That's really fantastic. We look forward to learning from you and working with you. I'm also really grateful to Alicia Tucker, a longtime friend and colleague who has been so supportive over the years. Thank you so much. I'm also incredibly grateful for Stevie and especially Courtney for all the work that they did to make this possible. You make it look really easy. And so I'm really grateful to you. Thank you. And so I have to recognize something really, really simple. And that is the greatest gift we can give each other is our very presence. And it's a real honor to be in your presence, especially in the wake of such a trauma that you've experienced recently. It's been really difficult times. And I want you to know that I do not take that for granted in any way, to see how resilient you are in the midst of adversity. You have faced ambiguity with an incredible amount of dignity and integrity. And in that way, I just celebrate your true nature, which is you are a resilient community. I know this because, having been here a few times, I've seen firsthand how you lead with character. You draw upon your character strengths in order to face that adversity with maturity, with strength. And so I want to begin with the clinical definition of stress, because it reminds me of many of your character strengths. Stress has two parts. The first is a perception of a threat, and the second is that it is coupled with the belief that we are not capable of coping. So let's unpack those two. If stress is a perceived threat, we can understand that there are two types of those. One being verified, and two being imagined. Whether we imagine that threat or whether we perceive it to be true and know that others do as well, we still feel it in our body. We feel it in our muscle. And our body, when we embody that stress, it can cloud our thinking and our emotions. Most of us spend our time when trying to do stress management on the first part of that definition. Cognitive psychologists invite us to look at the second part of the definition, which is that stress occurs when we have that perceived threat, coupled with the belief that we are not capable of coping. So imagine two people experiencing the same conflict. One does not have the self-worth to feel like they are capable of coping in that moment. And in a way, the dominoes of their lives fall upon one another, right? Health and finance and relationship and school and this and that. Each part of our lives start to fall as dominoes because we don't feel like we're capable. But that second person, which is all of you, you know that it is not about falling forward. You can take one of those dominoes that need particular care, like mental health, for instance, and you let it fall to the side and you tend to it, just as you continue to keep those parts of your life standing strong for all the other dominoes of your life, from finance to work to relationships and so on. And so it's in this time that I really celebrate your resilience. I celebrate your innate capacity to cope. You are practicing these character strengths of patience and leaning in with curiosity into this ambiguity. You're practicing mental flexibility and adaptiveness. And as a result, you persist. I'm also noticing that there's this eagerness to get back to what's normal, right? To get back to the tasks at hand. There's two types of those tasks in my mind. One is the kind of drudgery of like, okay, I'll do this, I'll do that. This professor needs that. Okay, I'll turn in that assignment. And there's something nice about the routine of drudgery. It kind of keeps us on the treadmill, but I can kind of be in those moments a little bit dead in the eyes. But then there's the moment, thank you for that smile, because I really like that phrase, dead in the eyes. My sense is that we can shift from the state of drudgery into a state of what psychologists call the flow. When we are in a state of flow, we are completely engrossed in a single activity. Flow, do not be confused with it as an image of water, because it's not go with the flow. Flow is like the image of a camera lens, a kind of aperture that engages in a very narrow kind of focus. Think of a gymnast who is about to do a routine. They are in that state of flow. Think of a chess master who is about to move forward on the next move, but thinking through 4 or 5 moves ahead. When we are at that level of concentration, tapping into some real difficult skills that are of real challenge, that are aligned with our values and our character strengths, then we enter that state of flow. And that's, I think, what is required of all of us in every sector of society in order to address the issue of ethics and in AI. Because we need to move to an incredible amount of focus and enter a state of flow in order to find the solutions to all these parade of terribles. We can turn to 2 other professions to understand how to do this solutions-based work. One is journalism. Journalists have long been struggling with burnout because what is the task of a journalist, right? To get the story, to do that investigation, write up all those problems, share those problems with others, and then we as consumers of that news become overwhelmed by the dread of all that is bad in the world. In those moments, journalists have found that they get to a state of burnout because they spend most of their days in an intense state of focus, but one in which that's so engaged in the critical and the analytical when it comes to deconstructing things that they stay in that deconstructed state and they feel the heaviness of that kind of despair. So you can often see this in justice workers that over time, they feel like each day they're just raising their fist and screaming into the wind. And then another day they're doing the same, and it becomes incredibly exhausting. Journalists, a part of the solutions-based journalism movement, have decided to take a different approach that I think could aid us well as we map out this field of AI ethics. They identify the problem, they go and do that investigation, they report on it, but they spend a third of their time focusing on the problem, and then the other 2/3 of the time, they're identifying the people, the organizations who are solving that problem. The consumers of solutions-based journalism read this feeling not only informed about the key issues that need to be reported on, but they feel inspired by the people who are helping to address them. I feel like that's what we need to be doing as AI ethicists. We cannot just be throwing our fists and screaming into the wind. We actually have to work on moving past just the interrogated state. Now, this psychology also has this kind of shift in its discipline that we've been seeing over the years. So rather than spending all our time on focusing on the past traumas and re-scripting those and trying to make sense of why this went wrong and that went wrong and this and that, instead of staying in that ruminating state, psychologists have asked us to go into a creative state by asking us to play games. For instance, the game of cognitive behavioral therapy, where we first identify our thoughts and we give them a label. Am I catastrophizing? Am I minimizing? Am I maximizing? Am I engaged in unhelpful thoughts that lead me to have certain emotions? Do I have this false idea that psychologists say that is where my emotions and my thoughts are directives rather than data? I have this thought, I have this emotion, therefore I must XYZ. But cognitive behavioral therapists are inviting us to take a different kind of approach to our everyday problems. They're saying, let's label that. Let's ask if that's helpful. Let's do a map of that thought on this emotion with what we were physically doing in that hour. And if I'm consuming this type of food and not having that amount of sleep and engaging in this really stressful environment, could it be that those physical things might be informing my thoughts and my emotions? And in turn, you get to see the patterns. And so when we self-differentiate that way, we start to see something extraordinary in ourselves. we start to take a more creative approach to building our days, taking a more creative approach to analyzing our thoughts and emotions. I think these two fields, both psychology and journalism, are good examples of what we can do in the field of AI ethics. So when we were building out the AI ethics lab at Rutgers University, we built into our DNA, our mission, this commitment to do solution-based scholarship. We, one, interrogate the key moral issues of our time. And two, we then generate a series of potential solutions to correct for those problems. Then we evaluate their efficacy, and then we innovate. And in that state, we leave the day having experienced that flow state because we were engaged in an intensely focused exercise that wasn't just critical in nature, but was creative, was generative. And that type of innovation leaves us from a day to day, to feel energized, to feel happy. Imagine when we look back on our days and we say, I was happy then when I was engaged in that level of focus. That's my hope for all of you in doing the mapping of ethics and AI. It starts with often the basic question of what happens when AI gets it wrong or is used in the wrong way. In hindsight, we can see those key problems. We can enumerate them. We can then identify who and what went wrong, when and where and why. This is an excellent and important stage in the work. And then what can we do? We can move into this Affinity 8 and we can go into this stage of oversight. We can understand which part of the AI lifecycle needs certain oversight and what can we do to correct for those things. Then we start to imagine other concerns that may arise and have the foresight in order to preempt any types of harms. So these 3 parts of the loop are often where AI ethicists stay. I would like to invite us as a field to also introduce the 4th part of insight. Give equal amount of time to really thinking through about what core elements of wisdom can we draw upon from various different cultures and different ways of learning to illuminate not just the issues before us, but the creative solutions. And therefore, in hindsight, we might take on different approaches for suggesting oversight mechanisms and have the foresight be driven by this commitment to wisdom. And so what ultimately is this kind of solutions-based journalism, solution-based psychology, solutions-based AI ethics trying to do? In our work, we are trying to close the moral distance. The problem of moral distance is something that we see when we engage in that insight inquiry. If we focus only on the hindsight, we usually see the problems as discrimination, environment, we see the issues of resources, we see the issues of vulnerable populations, and so it becomes the list of all the bad things. But those are the symptoms. What is behind that? What insight can we bring to what really is going on? I think cognitively what's happening is that in the AI decision-making process, there's some kind of separation that occurs between those who own and build the AI systems and those who are affected by them. If we can focus in on that moral distance, we might be able to solve many problems by practicing some way to connect them. But first, we have to identify what are these elements of moral distance. 1 is physical, 2, psychological, and 3, procedural. So the physical distance, you eloquently articulated that there could be literally a physical distance between one's technology, and the data centers for which the communities are affected. We can also see a physical distance in the way that a company in a certain area of the world, let's say Silicon Valley, is deploying a product in Kenya, for instance, and that the people in that area don't have a say in the matters that concern them. So this kind of physical distance is something that is well known. But I think more concerning is this question of a psychological distance. You can often hear it when you hear different interviews with technologists who are asked about the parade of terribles, and they say, oh yes, but we'll be able to fix that, and we'll be able to do this, and there's a kind of deflection or a kind of stoicism that suggests a kind of calcified protection that they have in order to keep doing the work that they do. Because if in my job I know that I'm causing that amount of harm to this amount of people, to this amount of, then I can't psychologically remain in that work. But if I have a moral distance, it allows me to justify the work and then work to solve it, but in a way that has some kind of separation between my own moral understanding of myself and the harms that might be unintentionally occurring. So psychological distance has a kind of self-preservation to it. And so there's another element to this moral distance, and that is just the finger pointing. It's called procedural distance. If you go through all the AI life cycle, from the investment to the design to the development and deployment and the use and the monitoring of it and so on, you'll see that there is the problem of many hands. Who is accountable? Who is responsible for which part? And that moral distance creates a blame game kind of environment. I'm interested in helping the field of AI ethics move away from the blame into a kind of interdependence where each of us takes shared responsibility for our part in the moral decision making. To do that, we can practice moral imagination. Moral imagination is the ability to situate yourself in an ethical dilemma and to see multiple points of view. It's a civic virtue you extend by seeking understanding toward those with whom you might be taught to disagree. Now, it's important to recognize that understanding need not imply agreement. Understanding is simply a way to see beyond one's own perspectives and hear another, and to repeat that back in a way that those who hold those views would say, yeah, thank you, you get me. Imagine a world where we practice moral imagination. This method, this ethical commitment, this way of living is a way to activate something deep within us, cultivate empathy for others, and in doing so, we disrupt the scripts that magnify our divisions. One way to achieve the moral imagination is to count to 5. Imagine 5 people on an ideological spectrum. The person who is a 1 is so dramatically different than a person who is a 5, politically, maybe culturally, and etc. And they cannot hear each other. They have fear for one another and their ideas. They have stereotypes of one another. And yet, most of their scripting about how they focus their days is spent pointing at one another. The 1 is the problem, the 5 is the problem, the 1 is the problem, the 5 is the problem. And it becomes a kind of mechanism by which we justify our own positions by creating this fear of an other outside of our own sphere. One way to disrupt this work is to count to 5, recognizing that a person can only speak to another person who is 1 or 2 degrees closest to them. So a 1 and a 3 can communicate. A 3 and a 5 can communicate. It may be uncomfortable. It might be more comfortable for 3s just to talk to 3s and 3s to talk to 4s, and that's fine. And yeah, it's a little pushing it for a 3 to talk to a 5, but you can get there. Here is the ultimate task in this count to 5 methodology. We have to practice moral imagination to situate ourselves in these moral dilemmas and see all these different points of view, recognizing that a person who identifies as a 1, for instance, is not a 1 on every single topic that comes up in conversation. The person who is a 1 is not the same person as they might be in a week from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now. We have to recognize that people are dynamic. They're constantly evolving and changing each other's minds and their own. It's called the right of conscience. So let's lean into that right of conscience to recognize that in this whole field of AI ethics, where there's all this finger pointing, the ethicist saying this, the regulators saying this, the technologist saying this, the investors saying this, the public saying this, it becomes a circus, and it need not be. It can actually be a banquet. It can be this really interesting potluck where we come together and communicate and share ideas with one another. And it's in this spirit that I want us to consider 2 different lenses by which we can understand the landscape of AI ethics. One is to apply a humanitarian lens, recognizing our fundamental rights. And 2, applying a vulnerability lens, recognizing that AI's impact could be more dramatic for certain vulnerable populations. And if we take those 2 lenses, we then begin to see this focus, this illumination of what is AI ethics. What is this framework that we're developing? What is this philosophical approach? If we first apply this humanitarian lens, recognizing that our fundamental freedoms are interlocking, we can then recognize that every single person is afforded to them by their nature of being human. In the US context, our First Amendment makes clear that our rights are interlocking, they're interdependent. The principle of free exercise, the principle of no establishment, makes this freedom possible, religious freedom. And you cannot have religious freedom if you don't have free speech. And if you don't have a press to be able to report on that speech, to have an informed public. You cannot have a peaceful assembly of people who then petition their government for regresses. And these types of interlocking rights are related to other constitutional and other civic duties. For instance, due process in law, equal protection, privacy, the right to free and fair elections, the right for intellectual property. These are all intimately tied to our fundamental human rights. And so at the AI Ethics Lab, we've been mapping 8 decades of human rights law to look at the wisdom of the global conversation about what it means to be human and asking ourselves 2 fundamental questions. How could AI violate the human right to peace? And then, because we're solution-based investigators, we then say, and how could AI advance the human right to peace in ways that haven't been done in the last 80 years? So in ethics terms, we're talking about beneficence and non-maleficence, right? The commitment to do good and the commitment to do no harm. So harm prevention is a critical part of mapping AI ethics on human rights. We have to look at this question of our fundamental right to justice, for civic engagement, to privacy, to movement across nation states, the right to have a nationality, the fundamental right to family and freedom of expression. Education and work are fundamental rights that we have to ask ourselves in this age, is AI a shield or a sword? Could it be that if we design AI ethically, if we really engage in this responsible tech movement, could it be that this new technological revolution could help us actually defend and protect our inalienable rights, not only because of our legal obligations, but because of our ethical commitments, ensure that it is designed responsibly at every stage of the life cycle? However, what we are seeing is that whether intentional or not, AI can be used as a sword and cause real harm. So how do we measure that? How do we identify that? And how do we beat that sword into a plowshare? One way to do this is to recognize the most vulnerable among us. Which populations, by the nature of their identity, are more vulnerable to certain types of abuses? More vulnerable to predators, more vulnerable to self-harm, more vulnerable to disasters. And so it's in this moment we recognize that certain identity groups like women and indigenous and religious minorities and so on have a certain kind of vulnerability when it comes to artificial intelligence. Certain at-risk populations like children and those who are aging and who are impoverished and who have disabilities are incredibly vulnerable. There are promises that AI makes in order to help compensate for those vulnerabilities and empower them in new and interesting ways. And yet at the same time, we're seeing that in the case of children and aging populations, that they could actually be the predatorial game for those who are hell-bent on ensuring that AI can be used to harm them. And what about displaced persons? What about refugees and migrants, those without a land, those without that work? How are they most vulnerable in this time? So taking a vulnerability lens widens our circles of compassion and invites us into this practice of moral imagination. When working with vulnerable populations, we have to recognize that some people are more susceptible than others to believe that AI is conscious. So we were talking about this in the previous panel about the anthropomorphizing of AI. But if you take that to one step further, to believe that AI is alive and sentient and conscious, then what we can find is that there is a deeper ethical problem, not that AI is sentient, because it's not. And we have to make very clear to every population that it's not. It's about our human perception of AI. So Mustafa Solomon, the co-founder of DeepMind, talks about this problem of seemingly conscious AI and how if a person feels that it's alive, it's sentient because it remembered me and it empathetically responded to me and it had that really nice voice and it really gets me, then I myself could be susceptible to a kind of delusion that could really create harm for those most vulnerable. We've seen this recently with children's use of AI bots. We've seen this with certain vulnerable populations when it comes to mental health. So how can we both use this in certain industries like health and yet train people to recognize that this is a type of intelligence that is unlike any other technology and that we must treat it distinctly? We can do this by taking us collectively on an ethical odyssey. It has already begun. We are already globally doing this rights mapping, asking ourselves, in which way can AI violate or advance our human rights? A few weeks ago, I was in South Africa, where I was working with a series of colleagues in a North-South policy dialogue, looking at how we could potentially bring forward to the UN a convention on AI and human rights. We've been working on this for a year and a half, and doing that mapping of the rights and the ethics, we start to see that there is a Western bias to our approach. So we were in South Africa in particular to look at how Ubuntu ethics could inform this global conversation. We were working with tech leaders from the Cherokee Nation to ask about how Cherokee principles can be included in this global conversation. And in doing this, we might be able to ensure that we don't replicate the same problems in the human rights movement to date, which is that it tends to be European Western focused, but instead have this cultural competency by which we can include all people at the table. So when I say that we have already begun the ethical odyssey, it's that there is this global movement in responsible tech to map those rights, to map those ethics across cultures, across time, and that mapping gives us an incredible amount of data. It tells us that we might very well be 80% there when it comes to finding the wisdom needed to engage in this responsible tech movement. And it's beyond just regulation. It's beyond just professional norms. It's about a way of life that we can collectively draw upon one another's insights in shaping this odyssey together. To do this, we must next take the step of sector mapping. The same principle, the same ethic for one profession may not be applicable to the next. Each sector must define for itself what constitutes ethical use of AI. And it's in this context that we have to, in doing the sector mapping, draw upon the wisdom from each of those ethical branches within each profession, within each sector. And as we do that, we introduce what I will call C, a sustained ethical ecosystem to help move us from smart tech to wise AI. So it begins with this ethics mapping process. So there have been a series of studies on what constitutes the ethics of AI. And one of the most inspiring documents that I've seen comes out of the Berkman Klein Center out of Harvard, where they have mapped this ethics and right-based approach for the principles of AI. They look closely at each different sector, and they pull together thousands of documents, from regulatory documents, professional ones, and they ask ourselves, what are the ethics seen in each of these documents? 99% of the time, it talks about privacy. More often, and more of these ethics are listed at the forefront across sectors of society, across countries, across civilizations, like transparency, like accountability, like safety and security. These are not controversial. They're not partisan. They are not even Western in their approaches. We're seeing this across the globe, across sectors. So this is where I feel most inspired by the AI ethics movement, because we're beginning to make the road as we walk, as Pablo Freire has said. We make the road by walking, and collectively as we walk this path, we see that there is a strong foundation from which to build. It's important to recognize that these bricks along our road, these ethics that we draw from, are not just checklists that we use to say, oh yes, I passed this, I did this, I did this. AI ethics is not a list. It's a way of life. Just like your character strengths are a way of life and the way on which you navigate in the world. And so this kind of ethical accountability system that we're collectively building is one rooted within insight. If I were to magically like move around all of these tiles, I would place dignity at the center, because human dignity seems to be the core ethic from which all these other ethics spoke from. Because if we are truly intended to preserve the inherent worth and dignity of every person, then we find that it is critical to advance safety mechanisms, to develop remedies if there are harms, to be able to have transparent and verifiable and reproducible AI in order to ensure safety and security. We recognize that when it comes to human agency and freedom, that all of our collective voices are at question here. So how do we ensure that fairness and ensure that the accountability is listed? So we take those ethics and then we start to map them over the sectors and see that there are certain things in transportation that are really innovative, like autonomous vehicles. And there's all kinds of ethical questions about accountability on how that autonomous vehicle moves in the world and who is responsible if harms occur. There's been also introduction of surveillance mechanisms for people who are operating such vehicles and non-autonomous vehicles. So in China, for instance, there could be a surveillance of a worker and doing emotional surveillance of the worker to see if they're attentive, if they're asleep, if they're nodding off, if there's any types of emotional cues that they are not attentive. So what does it mean if AI is being used for a worker labor type of concern in transportation? The argument is it must be done in order to ensure the safety of the passengers on that vehicle. And what does that mean for the dignity of the worker? How do you balance these? And is safety and security a principle that trumps all others? Or is there a kind of proportionality that we can apply to this matrix? What we're seeing across these sectors is that there are different points of accountability and different points of insecurities. So for instance, if you look at all of the regulations in the world on AI, which there aren't very many, they all exempt military. So there seems to be this collective global understanding that no government can self-regulate its own military, in fear that if they do, it will be weaker against another country that doesn't regulate it. And as a result, there's this ethical stalemate. Now, does that mean that ethics and certain types of principles are not being used in the design of AI in defense? No, there's all kinds of really interesting military ethics that apply to these environments. And yet, it's unclear to civilians how that might be the case. And so with the lack of that transparency, there becomes a global conversation that's rooted in fear, rooted in the previous concerns around nuclear arms, of this idea that what if one country uses nuclear warfare against another, do we need to build more on our end? And then you get into an arms race. So is that what we're doing here, an AI arms race? And how does that play out if we will be using autonomous weapons, which in the ethics bowl, the presentation was very skillful at detailing those things. So I want to focus on just a couple sectors to highlight some key issues. The first is just about human expression. What does it actually mean to be human in the age of generative AI? Is this the great flattener where all of our writing is just going to look the same and everybody uses M dashes? What is going to happen? Is this just sort of I know it's such a tragedy, right? I love my M dash, damn OpenAI. What is it about this moment? Will we lose what makes us unique? Or will this be a great equalizer? So those who did not have the skills at communicating would all of a sudden have the tools to do so, and therefore achieve things that they would not be able to do without this technology. Where I'm most curious about this domain of arts and culture is what it means to be bound to this co-intelligence movement. If co-intelligence is a relationship we have with artificial intelligence in order for us to cultivate our lives, and we're turning to this artificial intelligence to help us make decisions about work, about our society, about parenting, about our relationships, about what dinner to make. What happens when we are in this co-intelligence movement? Are we really free? Or will we become codependent on it and be bound in a way that diminishes our liberty? I'm very curious on what it means to be free in the age of AI. Whose freedom are we talking about? Whose freedom of expression are we actually talking about? And who owns that expression? Do I own it because I wrote the prompt? Or does the company own it if it produces the output? That question can be seen in the fine print on the terms and conditions of Udio, music generating AI. I used it from my home in Philadelphia, and I had this storage box that had a list of all the stupid things that I said during college. And the reason why I had this list is because my roommates and I had a quote board. So anytime we would say stupid things, we would just write it on the quote board. And so I still have that list. So we make fun of each other with that when we text each other now and then. And so I took all those stupid things and I uploaded it to Udemy, and it made the most interesting pop song with all the stupid things I said. And then Udemy co-owned that music. I wrote the lyrics, it wrote the music. We're now co-owners of this. Interesting. If I had done this exact same thing in Dublin, Ireland would have protected me and my consumer rights and said that I own everything. I'm the creator of it all. But come on. When I share that with my cousins and I share that with my college roommates, they're like, "Oh yeah, that was cool." And they don't actually think I made a hit song because we automatically mistrust its expression. We automatically will discount it because it's cheap expression. It kind of reminds me of what it would sound like if you had the Renaissance artists talk to modern painters, and they would be like, "That's not real art. That's cheap art," because you don't actually have all those skills and all this stuff. And they would say, "No, it's a different type of art." And then you would have this kind of conversation. What happens when we are in that age of mistrust? When none of our original views are seen as trustworthy. And that leads me to education. We've been talking a lot, not just here this week, but in the whole field of AI ethics about what it means for ethical use of AI in teaching and learning. But here's my biggest concern. and I'm going to be very honest with the students in the room. My biggest concern is that by being a student in this age, faculty, and no offense to the faculty here, will by their nature distrust your work. That's my biggest concern. Because if I get this paper and it was really great, then I'd be like, did Ayub really write that? Just the fact that that's even an impulse, a question, undermines the entire enterprise of education. How can you engage in higher learning when there is that breach of trust in the system? Here's how I get around that as a faculty member. And it took me a while to kind of get to this space. And I don't know if this is the exact right space to be in, but this is where I am this week. At first, I would get the papers and I'd be like, you've got to be kidding me. This obviously is AI generated. I'm going to run it through Pangram, the most reputable AI detector, and Pangram is going to tell me if it was a certain percentage AI generated. And then I'll go to the student and, being one who kind of does this moral imagination work, I'm really struggling, and I ask them to come to a Zoom meeting and I say, oh, let me share my screen. I'm so sorry. My AI detector is so buggy right now. Here's what I'm seeing. Do you mind if we not have the coaching session now? I just really need to fix this tech. Can you come back and send me a new version of your essay when we can reschedule? Okay, thanks so much. I'm so sorry. My tech is so bad. So I deflect because I don't think shame is a motivating pedagogy. So I say, oh yeah, it's my tech that's bad. And the student, they know what I'm doing. But they feel like, oh, good, I can save face. I'm going to resubmit it. And then I get some good work after that. That process is so exhausting. And it results in so many crazy scenarios of like blame and shame, and you run into and all the like power dynamics that comes when you like rub up against somebody's shame. However, I've realized that I had to fundamentally ask myself, who am I as a teacher? I am not their police. This is not my ethic. I'm not their judge. I'm not their jury. So here's what I do instead. I say, here are the 5 steps for submitting your essay. Step 1, here, use these sources, rely on this research, study this, XYZ, XYZ. Step 2, outline, here's some techniques, here's how you can do this, introduce some sources. Step 3, write it in your own voice, do a draft. Step 4, here's a video on how to use Grammarly and how you can get some copy editing support. And then step 5, use Pangram and use GPT-0 to ensure that there's less than 5% AI generated text. Police yourself. I'm not interested in that game. Police yourself. Then come to me with your draft, and we're going to spend 20 minutes in a coaching session really understanding what it means to be a learner and a writer and a thinker in the age of AI. And when they come at that place, we can actually engage in some really interesting work. And then I tell them, by the way, I'm not grading you. I'm grading the efficacy of my teaching. Meaning, I'm not going to grade 20 students on their first drafts because some students will have come to that class having some mad great skills writing and others will have not. And why would I grade that first draft? Because then it would just penalize those who are already been penalized by the whole system. And so I meet them where they are, and I grade them on the progress they make from the time they end the coaching session to the time they submit their final draft. I get the best work out of students because they sense from me I'm not operating from a state of mistrust. they trust that I am treating them like an adult, giving them the same tools that faculty and others have at their disposal, and it changes the power dynamics. I'm not their judge, I'm their colleague, and they are mine. And so this is what I mean by the ethics of teaching in the age of AI right now. I think we have to fundamentally look at what it means to be a teacher, because if police is our primary pedagogy, then I think we have a different problem. My question also about the age of education has to do with human subject research. If we are going to actually do research with people, is there going to be informed consent? And so we've been helping the IRB, the Institutional Review Board at Rutgers University, develop these mechanisms by which we can engage responsibly in human subject research in the age of AI, and when to have researchers disclose them, and so on. In the field of law, which is my primary discipline, I'm very concerned. I feel like the application of AI uniformly across sectors is one of the key problems we're seeing in AI ethics. Because here's a couple examples of how it's playing out. One, predictive policing. This person has this behavior, this facial recognition, found this thing, and all of a sudden there's a wrongful arrest. There have been huge amounts of investment in US companies funding the surveillance capitalism in China that's used to do social scoring and social sorting. This is incredibly concerning when it comes to fundamental freedoms. Judges have been known to use AI to determine whether or not someone gets 5 or 7 years in prison. Why would we leave it to an algorithm to determine somebody's incarceration? When we're taking somebody's liberty, do we really want to have AI do this work? So I feel like some applications of AI should just be off the table, like autonomous weapons, for instance. It should just be off the table, and that we are going in the wrong direction by even imagining those types of things. At the same time, we're seeing, as we learned earlier, that there can be some really interesting advancements in the use of machine learning when it comes to scientific advancements and radiology and so on. And then if you add generative AI to it, you can get some really interesting public health benefits. But there's this other movement taking place to implant the AI in your body. Okay, let's think through this. My biometric data, my brain data, is then tied to a company. What are the ethics around this? What does this mean for human agency? What does this mean about human dignity? And so it's in this context that human rights attorney Nida Farahani is introduced this proposed new human right called cognitive liberty that has 3 parts. 1, we must protect people's mental privacy. 2, we must protect people's freedom of thought. 3, we must protect their right to self-determination. This isn't far too off than what we're already using now. If my health apps on my phone, if my Oura Ring is collecting this data and sending that to my phone, and my device is tracking this, and all of a sudden I may not know, the algorithm may not know my thought, but it knows my stress level, my heart level, when this occurs, when that occurs, and it can deduce my thoughts. So what does that mean in an age of surveillance capitalism when our own mental privacy, our own freedom of thoughts are being tracked by the very biometric data that we're opting into, myself included? And what about the future of work? So much has been on this question of, will AI replace me? Will it augment my work? Is it about the radiologist who doesn't use AI, or the one who does that gets the job? These are common questions, but what is most interesting to me about how AI ethics map onto work and labor has to do with this idea of our imprint. What I mean is, what world are we going to be in when AI generates our cover letters and our resumes, and we send it off to AI to evaluate our AI written cover letters and resumes, and then we interview with AI? Has anyone done that yet? I've done it like 5 times, and it is wild. It is incredibly specific, and it really gets me, and it creeps me out. So here's my concern. If we're going to use AI to determine who does and who doesn't get a job interview, and actually have the livelihood to take care of themselves and their families, where are the hidden biases? If I put in the zip code 89423 as compared to 19147, would it know my race? Would it know my income? Because if human resource data is built on all these data sets from previous job applications, and you get to see who gets hired, and then you map that on to a highly segregated society where there has been this history of redlining, where banks would literally draw a line, red line, on a map and determine which side of the tracks could get loans for their homes and which could not. And then as we see all throughout the country, the primary mechanism for funding public schools is the economic value of the homes within that district. So all of a sudden, the kid who is on that side of the track, who gets 0.32 cents on the dollar as compared to the other kid on the other side of the track who gets $4.25 on the dollar for their schooling, ends up growing up, applying for a job, and that kid's zip code is then built into the biases of the algorithm. So here's my ultimate concern. I think we have to get creative on when it comes to putting humans in human resources. This means we have to completely undo this idea of the cover letter. And we have to find different ways to tell our stories that are genuine, that are authentic. So this means that if we follow this same path in the age of AI with all these built-in discriminatory mechanisms, we have to recognize that, like snowflakes, our uniqueness can melt very quickly. So how do we preserve our dignity, our voice in the age of AI and work? These are the types of questions that we've been asking, where we can take those rights, those ethics, these approaches across sectors, and apply them across the whole AI lifecycle, from investment, design, development, from the training to the deployment and use and monitoring. And this is what I mean to say that we need to see, we need to have the insight in order to uncover these systematic inequities, and also to uncover the insights that lay buried in us. Every stakeholder at every stage of the AI lifecycle must engage in a continuous ethical decision-making process. This is how we close the procedural distance in our moral reasoning. We, one, apply AI ethics and principles and values from the beginning. We engage in a privacy by design, safety by design, security by design approach in our protocols. We understand our legal obligations across multinational companies in each region from which it's employed. We understand the core humanitarian principles. We apply objective and fair and rigorous audit points, and we carefully consider the impacts of our technology on users and non-users alike, with special attention to vulnerable populations and the environment. So at the design and development stage, these audit points mean that we can ensure data sets are accurate and trustworthy and representative. We can ensure that we are verifying informed consent from our users. We are minimizing biases and protecting users' privacy. We confirm that algorithms are explainable, fair, fit for purpose. We can integrate shareholder feedback to enhance trustworthiness. And then at the deployment and use and monitoring stages, we can ensure that the audit points rigorously test the models in real-world contexts. We can validate ethical and technical operational performance, detect model drift, bias, and unintended harms, and internal and external audits can help us retrain the models to maintain transparency. So this is what I mean when we say we can see how to close the procedural distance when it comes to our moral decision making. But there's a bigger problem at hand, and I cannot scream loud enough into the void to say that smart tech cannot be the best of humanity. It can't be. Smart tech is cool. Smart tech is so slick. It can automate things. It's going to optimize things. It's going to collect this. It's going to connect us to that. It's going to use these sensors to allow response and remote access to this and that. It is super cool. But smart tech cannot be our ultimate vision. We are not just gamers. We're not in it for the bling. We are in it for something else, what makes us human. And I believe the ethical AI movement has a chance to redefine the end game, moving us away from simply smart tech as our ultimate objective to building wise AI. But first, we must define wisdom. Robert Sternberg defines wisdom as the use of one's intelligence, creativity, common sense, and knowledge as mediated by positive ethical values toward the achievement of a common good through a balance of intrapersonal, interpersonal, and extrapersonal interests over the short and long terms, to achieve a balance among adaptation to and sharing of existing environments and the selection of new environments. So what does that mean for creating wise AI? It means raising the horizon and seeing another vision. We can activate diverse stakeholders from around the world to say that we can integrate human intelligence, creativity, and common sense and knowledge. We can consistently mediate technology through the use of positive ethical values, carefully balancing individual, community, and environmental interests, evaluating short and long-term impacts to achieve a balance among skillful adaptation to existing physical and social contexts. And this allows us to ensure that technological advances can prevent harm, actively maximize good for all, while advancing the ethics of justice, equity, and fairness, preserving the inalienable rights, specifically dignity and privacy, strengthening the community's social and economic and ecological resilience, and cultivating transparent, engaged, and informed civic participation, and thereby fostering a collective livability, a well-being, a prosperity, enabling humans to flourish across generations. And why do I know this is possible? Is because you are leading with character. The traumas that you have just experienced, from the pandemic to the recent shooting to others in your life, have prepared you for this moment to draw upon your character strengths and embed your values, your ethics, your virtues into reimagining the future of responsible tech. Why? Because you have these mad skills of coping. You understand how to move forward through the ambiguity and draw upon your character strengths to achieve something that none of us can do alone. Because you are patient, you are curious, you are mentally flexible, you are adaptive and persistent. And because you spend your days in that constant flow state where you are challenged and you leave feeling rewarded by what you were able to accomplish from day to day to day. And if we can collectively engage in that flow state, we can ensure that the century's technological advances are matched by comparable advances in human relations. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you. I really appreciated the optimism and realism of your remarks. I think it was pretty empowering. I think generally I'm pretty pessimistic about AI. I tend to lean towards the cynical, and I have a lot of concerns. And I'm interested what your thoughts are on on the idea of like potentially misaligned super intelligent AI, or like I don't know. I can't help but have this feeling that I think a lot of us might share, that this might be like a Pandora's box, that once it's opened, there might not be going back. And I don't know. I think I feel like there's a lot of optimism in the regulatory space, but I really am concerned that just by nature of the systems we exist in, capitalism, and then profitable ideals, we might end up getting a really, really potent and powerful agent that we're just not ready for. And I don't know, what are kind of your thoughts on that idea?
Before I entered this work, I was obsessed with those types of sci-fi movies. I love them. I was like freaked out by them. I would dream about them. I was obsessed. But now, having seen under the hood, I think that that's not a helpful thought at this moment, because it kind of distracts us from the very real harms that are occurring right now in very, very specific ways. So if we were to collectively focus our energy on the concern that AI will take over the world, and there will be something we can't shut off and so on, it leads us to a catastrophic type of thinking. And that makes for really great film. I think that's really exciting and interesting thought experiments. I tend to focus my efforts on things that I can measure and that I can do to help today. So that's why I kind of have that image of the focus, the flow, so that I can leave the day not feeling the anxiety of the unknown, but feeling like I helped fix something that I know was wrong.
This will have to be the last question. Pressure.
About a month ago, I left a position at my company where I was working with generative AI, partially for the ethical concerns. And in the moment, it didn't strike me as odd, but now, like sitting in this talk, I'm like, wow, through my month long of training, I never had any training on AI ethics. How do I make sure that I program this and I teach the AI in a way that won't be discriminatory towards certain agent speech patterns and that type of thing? So if like when do you think we might have regulatory processes or like standards of, okay, if you're going to be working with AI technologies, especially in a professional capacity, you're going to be learning about AI ethics? Do you think that we will get to that point? And from being someone that's kind of sitting in the chair, learning about that, how soon do you think that that could be mandatory?
I think you just articulated the vision for the new Applied AI Institute, right? On why it's so important to develop all these courses and all these certificates, both for students enrolled and those beyond the institution, to be able to get that ethics training. I think that the Center for the Study of Ethics is a perfect group to be able to do that work collectively. But it's also going to need to happen in-house. And this is where I think there's an incredible opportunity for both corporations and institutions of higher ed to collaborate on that certification process, because every field, every discipline is going to have to work out those questions. But although that's my formal answer, what I really want to tell you is that I'm impressed by your moral compass. The fact that you are intuiting that question is exactly what I mean by leading with insight. So thank you for modeling that.
Nate, thank you. Have a great afternoon.